The only potential risk with the national debt increasing over time is inflation.
Really? There's no other risk to debt? Well, no one should be taking financial advice from you.
An unconventional economic theory is gaining some traction thanks to the policy teams of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders.
Wow, the dream team, I guess.
So MMT starts with a simple observation, and that is that the US dollar is a simple public monopoly.
And we're always told that monopolies are bad, so this must be bad too, right?
The federal government is nothing like a household. In order for households or private businesses to be able to spend, they've got to come up with the money, right? And the federal government, it can never run out of money. It cannot face a solvency problem.
Meanwhile, in reality, it's the Federal Reserve that's in charge of the money supply. The federal government runs a debt by borrowing money. Ordinarily, that would push up interest rates, but the Fed wants interest rates to be stable. So, am I having deja vu here? Isn't this like the 5th time I've covered this? What's it gonna take for people to start listening? Anyway, to keep interest rates the same, the Fed has to inject new money into the banking system. That is how federal debt increases the monetary base. How can that possibly be maintained forever?
Normally, I think people tend to hear deficit and think it's something that we should strive to eliminate.
Yeah, how foolish of them, I guess.
And the truth is, the deficit can be too big. Evidence of a deficit that's too big would be inflation. But the deficit can also be too small. It can be too small to support demand in the economy.
Too small to support demand in the economy? Demand for what?
And evidence of a deficit that is too small is unemployment.
Oh, wait, we're doing the long-debunked Phillips curve, aren't we? The Phillips curve is a supposed relationship between inflation and unemployment. According to the Keynesian model, they're inversely related. One of them increasing means the other is decreasing. So according to Keynesianism, if you want to solve the problem of unemployment, just run a deficit and juice up inflation. That was the darling of the Keynesian model until the 1970s, when all of a sudden you started having both rising inflation and rising unemployment. How can that be? The fact is, the Phillips curve is misnamed. William Phillips had done a statistical analysis of economic indicators, and he noted it as a trivial coincidence. It was Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow who actually made something out of it. And it was Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps who successfully predicted its collapse. In particular, Friedman successfully predicted that in the 1973-75 recession, both inflation and unemployment would increase. So then it was retconned to a short-term relationship. But at best, this is a market tendency. It isn't something you can control by manipulating one or the other. You can't reduce unemployment by inflating the currency any more than you can stop inflation by firing a bunch of people.
Then imagine a government that spends $100 into the U.S. economy, but it only taxes 90 of those dollars back out.
First problem, where did they get the $100 to begin with?
We label that a government deficit.
No, we don't. Well, you might because you're a moron, but sensible people know that the deficit is when the government wants to spend $100, but only gets $90 in taxes, so it borrows the other $10 by creating bonds or whatever. That's what a deficit is.
But what we forget to do is pay attention to the fact that there's now $10 somewhere in the economy that wouldn't have been there otherwise.
No, there's just $10 the government borrowed that it now has to pay back with interest.
And the question is then, should you expand fiscal policy? Should you run bigger budget deficits in order to boost growth?
And the answer is no, because that doesn't boost growth. It just takes $10 in investment dollars that would have been invested somewhere more worthwhile to go to the pet boondoggles of politicians. What it does do, and this is the part I keep having to repeat myself on, is increase the demand for loanable funds, which increases interest rates. But the Fed doesn't want interest rates to go up, so it has to force them back down by increasing the supply of loanable funds, which it does by creating money out of thin air and injecting it into the banking system. That is where the inflation comes from.
Economists tend to understand that the kinds of things that you can do to boost longer-term growth are investments in things like education, infrastructure, R&D.
No, they don't. They understand that the way you boost long-term growth is by investment in what people demand. When you monkey with that, you just replace that by investment in what politicians demand.
So there are ways in which the government can make investments today that increase deficits today, that produce higher growth tomorrow, and build in the extra capacity to absorb those higher deficits.
Funny how it's never once worked out that way.
If you look at Japan today...
Yes, Japan. The country whose lost decade is now in its 30th year.
You see a country where the debt to GDP ratio is something like 240%, well above, orders of magnitude above where the U.S. is today, or even where the U.S. is forecast to be in the future. And so the question is, how is Japan able to sustain a debt of that size?
Well, the phrase lost decades would seem to imply that it isn't, don't you think? With what was termed zombie banks injecting funds into zombie firms that were too big to fail, which then failed, and the zombie banks started merging until there were just 4 left. And if there were anything to MMT, none of this would have happened. And those very same policies, intended to fix the problem, haven't resulted in anywhere near the expected rise in wages, consumption, or productivity.
So despite the size of the debt, there are no negative consequences. If you think about what happened after World War II, when the U.S. national debt went in excess of 100%, close to 125% of GDP.
What happened after World War II was a massive scaling back of deficits and taxation, exactly the opposite of what you want. And 1946 and 47 became 2 of the most productive years of the 20th century. The prosperity that followed was not the result of the war or the deficit spending. It was the result of the reversal of those policies.
And of course, the next generation inherits those bonds. They don't become burdens to the next generation. They become their assets.
I'm going to link to a talk by economist Robert Murphy where he blows this idea apart and shows exactly how deficits are not assets to subsequent generations. And he does so with a clear breakdown that's easy to understand and impossible to reasonably deny. And in fact, doing this analysis caused Murphy to change his own mind about what the conclusion should be.
The only potential risk with the national debt increasing over time is inflation.
As Murphy's illustration shows, even without inflation, everyone is worse off than the previous generations the moment the bonds start to mature and have to be paid off with taxation, even if you offset the taxation with additional deficits.
So the best defense against inflation is a good offense.
That doesn't even make sense. As stupid as that aphorism is at the best of times, here it's just a substitute for thinking. The best defense against inflation is to stop printing money. But if you do that, then interest rates are going to go up as government borrows, which is going to put a limit on the amount government can borrow. Which is a good thing, by the way.
I don't see any other macro school of thought pay as careful attention as we do to the inflation risk question.
Austrians? Monetarists? Real business cycle theorists?
And I think the first thing you have to do is say, what is driving the inflation?
Insane money creation. Well, that was easy.
Because to think that the inflation that is going to become important at some future date is likely to be the result of too much aggregate spending is really hard to believe.
It really isn't if you understand how this works and think it through. Of course, to do that, you'd be able to think, and that leaves Kelton out. So thanks for watching. Please hit like and subscribe, leave a comment, and go to donate.pugosity.tv to keep me doing what I do. And check out all the great content here, like this video selected just for you.